Should we start with the hot potato that's gone on these shores, which is the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, who has behaved like an ambassador during her tenure, kind of went back to her right-wing kind of Likud kind of idea, and as ambassador felt it was time to say what she really thinks in her former political role, which is that the two-state solution is over. What do you say to that, Barak?
Look, I think that a slogan should not be synonymous with actual policy. So a two-state solution sounds nice in the abstract, but from a British perspective or a European or American Western perspective, we need to consider what would be the strategic interests that we would have in a Palestinian state. A Palestinian state, a state in general, is not something that one automatically deserves. One needs to work their way in order to establish a functional, coherent, positive state. In order to achieve a state, you need to lay the building blocks of civil society, good governance, liberal ideology, transparency and accountability. The Palestinians have none of that. Whether if we look at the Palestinian Authority that justified the October the 7th attacks, that have a pay-for-slay scheme where it gives money to the families of Hamas terrorists,
who kill Israelis and civilians who aren't Israeli inside Israel.
And this is the group that the Biden administration seeks to revitalise. Or if you look at Hamas, that has a genocidal platform. Now, Stanford University had a poll that spoke about increasing discontent amongst Palestinians for Hamas. But it's misleading because that discontent is not at an ideological level. It's at the fact that they're seeing, OK, there's corruption, the fact that resources aren't reaching the people, so they're very disgruntled with Hamas on that. But if I can cite to you two polls that just demonstrate the sentiment amongst the Palestinian population that has been cultivated by Hamas, by Palestinian Authority, it's just quite remarkable. The Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, which is the Khalil Shikaki, they're very serious polls. It found that 72% of respondents believe that Hamas was correct to launch the October the 7th massacre. This was echoed by a Birzeit University poll on November the 4th that has its Arab World for Research and Development. When asked the question, how much do you support the military operation carried out by the Palestinian resistance led by Hamas on October the 7th, an overwhelming majority, 63.6% said that they supported the attack extremely, right?
And these are figures that come from the Palestinian side.
Comes from the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Now, already beforehand, by the way, in the West Bank it was higher. It was 83%, right? In June, prior to these attacks, 79%, the Khalil Shikaki polls showed that 79% in the Gaza Strip and 66% in the West Bank favour forming armed groups such as Lion's Den and the Jenin Battalion to strike at Israel. More than 85% said that the Palestinian Authority does not have the right to arrest members of these armed groups to prevent them from carrying out attacks against Israel. And again, this was reflected by the Birzeit University polls that showed 84% supporting Islamic Jihad, 80% supporting Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, 89% supporting the Al-Qassam Brigade, and Hamas receiving 76%. But you're talking about an overwhelming majority of the Palestinian public that has been brainwashed, indoctrinated for decades, and it's been with our funding as well. This is the irony.
Yes. There is funding going to the Palestinian cause from Western society. OK. So let's try and unpack where we can solve this. And where we can solve this is via the Sunni Gulf Arab communities who have finally buried the hatchet, looked at Israel's foreign policy, shrugged their shoulders and said, well, they've never declared war on us. And we're talking about the Abraham's accord signatories of the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and amazingly, Sudan, and under the table cooperation with the daddy, Saudi Arabia. Now, obviously, the relationship with Saudi Arabia is on hold for the day after the war, but on the basis that those guys and that very, very significant population, the oil and gas-rich energy leaders, who are also threatened by Iran as well, who also believe in putting people on the moon, NEOM, divesting into golf and football, and everything else that also Israel believes in, a 2.0, even a 3.0 economy. Is that where the solution comes from? Can we, with our Arab friends, go to their brothers and sisters and fund their de-radicalisation so that when NEOM is built in Saudi Arabia in 2030, we may have an advocate at the table, a Palestinian leadership that isn't radicalised like it is today in such number?
Look, the question really, based on what you've said, is will the Gulf Arabs manage to successfully de-radicalise the population by developing infrastructure?
Yeah.
Now, when I look at the West, for all the US critique of the fact you have a lot, General Petraeus saying we need to, Israel needs to emulate the counterinsurgency strategy where radical Sunnis were peeled off from Al-Qaeda. That only worked while America was occupying Iraq, and it worked for a brief period of time during the 2007 surge. As soon as American troops left, there was a spike in extremism once again. And I don't think, for all the talk of winning hearts and minds, we have never, ever been successful in counter-radicalisation or winning hearts and minds, whether it be domestically or abroad. So I just wonder whether developing infrastructure, throwing money at the problem, is synonymous with actually actively counter-radicalising a population. It's just never been done before.
Now, Israel is prosecuting this war at speed. It's the tradition to do so because, I guess, two reasons. First of all, the longer a war goes on, the more of its own soldiers die. And the second thing is public opinion, this constant noise from the United Nations, from the European Union, from the White House, saying on the spectrum from ceasefire now to a pause for humanitarian beliefs, and then perhaps we can sort of move towards a ceasefire, as Lord Cameron is talking about, but not yet. That means Israel is on a timeout situation that no other country has.
On this exact point, I was speaking to Lord Andrew Roberts, who co-authored a book with General Petraeus about the way Israel is conducting this conflict. And I have to tell you, I'm quite critical of the way Israel is conducting this conflict, but for very different reasons that one would usually anticipate. If you're going to fight a war and you're committed to fighting a war, you need to recognise the tragic implications that there are going to be civilian casualties. Yes. Israel has this Monty Python-esque way of fighting this conflict. John Kirby says Israel releases in advance maps showing target zones of where Israel plans to strike in advance. And he said, I'm not sure us Americans would do the same thing. So what happens is Israel goes into Gaza, it drops dummy bombs, it sends lots of texts, leaflets, where they're going to be striking. It gives Hamas the incentives to move their assets, take human shields, so that actually complicates the problem. Then afterwards it announces, well, we're going to be focusing on the north. civilians should move to the south.
Yes.
So what happens is, obviously, many Hamas operatives move to the south, including Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October 7th attacks, in a humanitarian convoy. The south becomes much more densely populated, harder for Israel to distinguish between civilians and combatants.
As we saw with the friendly fire deaths of 3 Israeli hostages.
And then it says, we're going to establish humanitarian zones which we're not going to target at all, from which Hamas launches rockets from those specific areas. It's unprecedented for any military to be conducting humanitarian zones, humanitarian corridors, humanitarian pauses to discuss ceasefires while they are conducting warfare. And this only benefits Hamas. It also, ironically, extends the conflict, it extends the duration of the conflict, by which Israel is subjected to greater international criticism, ironically, because it sought to minimise civilian casualties in the first place. So this is an absurd situation.
This is Barak Sina. He is a senior fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. And this is another How to Make Peace in the Middle East. In just a moment,